When we look at Mark Antony, he's obviously one of those names that still commands recognition, and it's because of Shakespeare. It's because of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor and, all the other stage and screen representations, and it's partly because he has this affair with Cleopatra, who is so famous, so charismatic, even from this distance. The problem is that it tends to cast both he and Caesar in particular roles that don't really tie in with the reality. It starts there in Plutarch, because Shakespeare particularly drew so heavily on Plutarch, that Mark Antony must be the bluff, simple soldier, hard drinking, hard fighting, very capable, but who's just outwitted, partly by his passion that, he just can't control himself, but also by the fact that he comes up against a political manipulator who isn't brave, who isn't a good general, but can find people who are and use them, and who always outthinks you, and who maneuvers you into being the bad guy and the enemy of Rome and the man corrupted by the East and seduced by this, Eastern woman and all this sort of thing. The big problem is that when you actually look at Antony's career, you discover someone who is very, very different. And this is beyond the basic things. Antony always has to be Cleopatra's young, dashing lover compared to Caesar, the old man. But by the time he kills himself, Antony's well into middle age, and the representations of him suggest someone, very bull, thick-necked and inclined towards putting on weight, stocky. He isn't particularly dashing or handsome. But this is someone as well who Cicero will tell us, describes himself as a consul and an Antonius. This is the ultimate aristocrat, unlike Julius Caesar, the man born into a family that is riding the wave very well, that is doing well, and considers the consulship and prominence his birthright. I'm born to this because I'm an Antony. And it doesn't matter if I'm in debt, if I've spent and wasted all my money. I can hang around with actors and actresses and former slaves and all this sort of thing, because I don't have to prove that I'm an aristocrat, like these sort of parvenus like Cicero, or half the rest of the Senate. But the most striking thing when you look at Antony is actually his military career, or really his lack of it. He serves under Gabinius as a dashing young cavalry leader in his probably late teens, early 20s. And does a few things. He fights against when they intervene in the civil war in Judea. He is part of the expedition to restore Cleopatra's father to the throne of Egypt, and he manages to arrive with a small body of cavalry, gets there, the firstest with the mostest sort of thing, and surprises people and wins. He does some brave, dashing stuff, but this isn't really methodical warfare against a skilled opponent. After that, he has very little military experience at all. We talk all the time about, he goes off and serves with Caesar in Gaul, but he doesn't spend very long there. And because of all the confusion that's going on with Roman elections, when he goes back to seek election to the quaestorship and returns to Gaul, he has to spend much longer than normal in Italy and in Rome. So he doesn't have a lot of experience in Gaul. And he turns up for the end of the 52 BC campaign and is at Alesia and does quite well. But he gets these independent commands in charge of a legion briefly, but it's when things are nearly all over. And then in the civil war, he doesn't spend much time fighting because he's an Antonius, because he's one of the few genuine aristocrats to back Julius Caesar. He's given political duties. He's left in charge in Italy, which, given that one thing Antony doesn't have is tact, is a big gamble on Caesar's part. This is the man who turns up to meetings in the forum and receives, deputations whilst he's hungover, supposedly pukes up either into his own lap or into a cloak held out by a friend, experiments with a chariot drawn by lions to just play act being Bacchus. This is really weird, flamboyant stuff. This is not what you want. This is the ancestor of Nero. Not surprisingly, the Romans wouldn't be surprised. This is the flamboyance. I can do what I like because I'm an aristocrat, and I'm always going to be Antonius, and I deserve to be at the top because that's how the state works. The Republic should work with people like me in charge. He goes off to take part in the latter stages of the campaign in Macedonia, and he'll command a wing at Pharsalus, but again, he's not there for most of the campaign. And in the subsequent bits of the Civil War, he goes back to Italy. He will serve later on in Spain, but he doesn't have extensive military experience. And when you think, yes, he raises an army from Caesar's legions in the aftermath of the assassination, but the campaign he then fights against Decimus Brutus The young Octavian, along with Hirtius and Pansa, who are not considered particularly experienced, but they have served under their Caesar's men, will go there and they will wallop Mark Antony, and Mark Antony has to retreat, and he only survives because he does the political deal with Lepidus and with Octavian, and they form the triumvirate. And then afterwards they've got overwhelming force, so yes, they can take Rome. And the Philippi campaign, yes, he does reasonably well, but he's fighting Brutus and Cassius has some experience from being Crassus's quaestor and then serving, protecting Syria afterwards, but it's fairly limited. Brutus has next to none. None of them have any experience of commanding armies consisting of, 19, 17 legions, massive forces. Again, clumsy, inexperienced, logistical nightmares to supply that had to fight fairly clumsy, plodding, attritional battles. So Antony wins there, but it's not against sort of the best opposition. And the campaign could have gone either way. And subsequently, the biggest example of this is that when he forms his great expedition to go and, whether it's to punish the Parthians for Crassus or whether it's simply to win glory there, to do what Julius Caesar was planning but was murdered before he could do. Again, massive army, talk of 100,000 men plus camp followers. He doesn't handle this force very well. He makes a series of mistakes. This is a man who feints towards the Euphrates, then embarks on a 400-500 mile march around through Armenia to attack Medea. Well, it isn't going to surprise the Parthians, who've got internal lines, and the one thing they're known for is their mobility. It's all very well to do that with 500 cavalry on a smaller scale. To do it with an army seems misguided. It means you begin the campaign late. You then, because your army can't move, or your siege train can't move fast enough, you leave it behind with just 2 legions as escort. Your baggage train, your siege train gets overwhelmed and destroyed, because how can 2 legions guard hundreds of wagons? It's sloppiness. It's a sense of, oh yeah, I can just do it, let's just charge in, and very brave, very bold. His heroism is then in inspiring an army in a retreat. And he loses control on several occasions. There's a story that he, contemplates getting his slave to kill him, in a moment of despair before he realizes. But he loses between a quarter and a third of his army and achieves nothing. And he retreats as well. And then, when you come into the Actium campaign, he doesn't use this army. He doesn't seem to know what to do with it, though it's really big. He fights this fleet action, but runs away or follows Cleopatra running away. And, people come out with all sorts of ideas. Oh, it was a plan. He'd lost strategically, so he needed to go somewhere else and form another army. Well, civil wars don't work like that amongst Romans. You can't lose the prestige. He did the worst thing a Roman aristocrat could do when he fled and abandoned his fleet and abandoned his army on land. The Romans can forgive someone who loses a battle, who's as thick as 2 short planks when it comes to commanding an army, as long as they're brave and determined and don't admit they're lost. But clearing off with Cleopatra's treasury and a few ships to Egypt, when how on earth are you going to raise another Roman army? Because this is a Roman civil war. So it shouldn't really surprise us that he makes so many mistakes, because this isn't actually an experienced commander, but it's someone who throughout their life has marketed themselves as a new Hercules, as a new Dionysus, both of whom were army commanders, as well as, they were famous for their victories as well as their personal sort of exploits, and who dresses like that. It's a little bit like people who've watched the movie Patton buying themselves, ivory-handled revolvers and polishing their helmet up to a sheen, or the people, who ate Napoleon in the 19th century, would do the hand in the shirt or would do some of these other gestures. But Antony is play acting the role of a great commander. And you always wonder if near the end he realizes that. But it shouldn't really have. It's not so surprising that he loses, because he isn't actually that good a commander. But he's got a lot of people to believe that he is, and posterity largely through Plutarch. And it is a wonderful contrast. You want in any sort of confrontation your main characters to be different. So one is apparently the weaker one, but prevails, and the macho, the great commander fails. That's far more dramatic than 2 people much the same fight each other. So, there's a power to the image of Antony, something he cultivated himself and then was taken on. But the truth is very, very different.